Hi, friends. I'm Rob Teigen.
And I'm Joanna, and this is the Growing Home Together podcast.
We're caring for the soul of your family, helping you grow closer to God
and each other.
Thank you for joining us today on the Growing Home Together podcast. My oldest son, Josh, is stepping into Joanna's seat on the podcast today so we can share a conversation about what it means to be a good man. Josh is the husband of 4 years to his wife, Cassie, and founded a ministry called Banner Media to share faith stories through film. To help us unpack the topic of biblical manhood, I'm also really excited to welcome writer, actor, and filmmaker Nathan Clarkson. He's a best-selling author who has a powerful new book called Good Man, An Honest Journey into Discovering Who Men Were Actually Created to Be. Thank you, Nathan, for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
We appreciate it. Well, I think this topic is a needed topic today for sure, and I would imagine kind of a daunting task, but what inspired you to write this book?
You know, that's an interesting question. I never originally thought, when I started out my this process of wanting to become a writer and an actor and an artist and all these different directions, I never thought I'd end up talking about men's issues. It wasn't something that was ever on the forefront of my mind. It wasn't something that I even felt particularly like I was an expert in. In fact, for many years, I always felt that I was striving after this idea of wanting to become a good man, but it was something I wasn't particularly good at. Mm-hmm. And it was something that I have always wanted, but I never saw myself writing a book about the subject. And I think it was a couple years ago that as I was living in Los Angeles at the time, and I had come in contact with some, how do I say this kindly, some really poor examples of men and behavior from men. And I looked at their behavior, at who they were, the things they said and the things they did and the destruction they caused around them. And, it happens in Los Angeles every day, but it happens around the world every day. I think we all have stories and anecdotes about men living wrongly and how that affects the world around them. But for me, when I saw this happen in really visceral ways that really affected personally the people around me, I started examining my own life, my own decisions, and my own choices much more closely. And I started asking myself the question, well, I can condemn these guys are bad, but am I a good man? What makes me better than them? What in my life makes my choices, my decisions, any better than them? And ultimately that led me to the question of who are men even made to be? Because I look in culture every day and I see that I think men are having an identity crisis. I think we get so many mixed messages, both from culture and even the church, that I think very often men have no idea who they were made to be. And so I started asking myself this question, who were men made to be? And obviously this question is going to lead me back to the creator of men, because I think if you want to find out what something is made for, you have to go to the creator. And so it was this journey of looking back over all these stories in my life and seeing God present in them and trying to discover who I as a man was made to be. So that's kind of where the book came out of.
Well, that's great. I love what you said. If we desire to live as we were created to live, we must be in connection with our Creator. And that kind of is to what you were saying, that on your journey, that's where you kind of had to look and start.
Absolutely. Yeah, that was definitely a beginning point for me. I think everyone has a desire in their heart to figure out why they're here, what they're for. I think, both believer and non-believer alike, we have this intrinsic desire to want to know who we are and what we're meant to live for. But I think the way we go wrong is that we ignore the one place, the one source of truth and definition that we'll find, and it's in our Creator. And I think so often, even I can forget, I can't define myself. I can't look for my purpose in these exterior things, either in the world or in culture or in politics, whatever it is. I have to go back to the root. I have to find what my Creator said about me, who my Creator designed me to be. And that's something I just don't see happening often in the world today. And I think it's so important that men start doing that so we can become who we were made to be.
Yeah, that's an awesome thought. I feel like even just in my life, that keeps coming up a lot lately as I'm growing up and getting to know more men. And we're all, I think, I just agree there's that need for that with a lot of men I'm around, that they want to figure out who God made them to be and how can they better live into that. And if we can kind of segue off of that, as I was reading through your book, you had one chapter specifically on community, but I also felt like it was actually a common thread kind of throughout the whole book, where even if you were talking about a different character trait or topic, stories that you shared seemed to revolve around a lot of community that you had with different guys around you. And as I think about this topic and what it means to be a good man, I've realized more and more how important it is that I have a community of guys around me to help me do that. And so I don't know if you just want to speak to that a little bit, of what role community plays in us now trying to become who God made us to be. And is there any, I guess, defining characteristics of that community that we should look for? Because obviously we can have great communities that support us, but also we can have a community that actually maybe inhibits us from getting there.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, this is something, it's an interesting subject for me, community, especially in talking about becoming a good man, because community honestly is really hard for me. And I think I've heard this reflected from a lot of men. It kind of has, men kind of have this stereotype about them that we want to do things on our own and figure it out on our own. You see it in the smallest tropes, like men don't want to ask for directions. But it's something in me, and I'm willing to say this, that it's really hard for me to ask for help, to be a part of a community, to be reliant or dependent on someone, to be open and honest and vulnerable with people. I have this desire to kind of be an island, to want to figure it out by myself and do it on my own. And so the whole idea of community is one that I have come to realize is so very necessary and important on my journey, but it's one I've actually had to struggle in not just finding, because I think many of us can understand how hard it is, especially in today's world, how hard it is to find a community, but even wanting to find a community, and even when you find one, being authentic and open inside that community. So it has been a journey for me, not only to realize how important community is, but to actually engage with community in a healthy way. But I can say that every time I have found a healthy community, every time I have found a group of men who are on the same journey, have the same desire to live into the life they were created to live, to know their Creator, to follow the dreams that God put on their heart in the way that He has asked them to, I have found myself becoming more healthy, becoming more whole. I found the weak places in my life becoming having less strength over me. And it's a humbling experience. It's a hard one on so many levels, but it's one that I found really, really worthwhile, and not even just worthwhile, but necessary along my path. And, a little bit off of what you said, you were absolutely right. I think it's in Proverbs where it says a companion of fools suffers harm, but those who walk with the wise will be wise. And so for me, there are no truer words spoken than who you are spending your time with. The community that you find, when you find one, will affect you. I have multiple times in my life have been desperate for friends and community, and have found myself in communities of guys who are not healthy, who don't have the desire to be good men. And even if they do, they're not living it out. And that has ultimately had a detrimental effect on my walk and on my path towards who I was made to be. And so I think there's so many levels here. One, it's hard to find community. Two, it's hard to want community sometimes. And three, sometimes the communities we find, we really have to be careful which ones those are, because like you said, whoever we spend time with will have a large effect on our walk. But it is a worthy goal. It's a worthy pursuit to find a community that you can rely upon, that will call you out. They'll give you wisdom and focus. I mean, there's so many aspects to how important community is, and I think that men today, especially in an isolated world, are having a really hard time finding it and even wanting it. But I would encourage you to really pursue that, because it is, and by you I mean anyone listening, it is so important for all of us men to have that community in our lives.
I think that even adds a little more weight to why it's important to be thinking about what you talk about in the book too, because it kind of helps give you parameters, I guess, for the type of community that you're looking for. Like if this is something that we want to grow in and becoming a better man, as you're out looking for that community, the goal is to find minded men who was like, hey, now you have a place to come from. Like, this is what I'm striving for. Are you someone that can be striving for that with me? And we can mutually help each other along, and just having that, being on that same page from the get-go, I think would help a lot. So,
yeah, I think C.S. Lewis said something about friendship consists of going towards a goal, running towards something, and looking over to your side and seeing someone else running towards the same goal, and saying, "Do you want to run with me?" And I'm totally paraphrasing here, obviously, but I think that's such a strong image that we ought to look for. Is that we ought to look for other people who in their life are running after their creator, and we can do that together. So it's an individual and a communal thing that happens all at once.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, to Josh's point too, a lot of you bring out some really great points in your book and some different topics, but some of those are wisdom and on authenticity and things like that. And those aren't things we it's pretty hard to be super authentic if we're just by ourselves, or find wisdom just in ourselves. So that's why we have to kind of branch out of ourselves, I guess. But as I think through, being a good man, it is kind of a journey of discovery in some respects, and we've stumbled and fallen in the process. So I'm just wondering, what are some of the roadblocks that you've run into as you've kind of walked on your road to discovering what a good man is?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's interesting. For a long time, I had this idea in my head that to be a good man was to be a perfect man. And then I read scripture, and then I read about every single man that God used. And I actually had this kind of, I wouldn't say crisis of faith. It was something I struggled with for a while. And it was me trying to figure out, why do some men go down in scripture history as being men after God's own heart, and people who we revere, even though they had enormous moral failings, physical failings, even though they were imperfect men in so many ways. Look at David and his committing adultery and his violence. Look at Saul and his violence and murders. Look at Peter, who doubted and denied God. So it's interesting to me, why do these men go down as heroes, and then you have men like Saul of the Old Testament, and you have Judas? What is the difference? Because we all make mistakes. What is the difference in the men who are ultimately conquer and seen as conquerors, and the ones who we see as bad examples of men? And to me, it comes down to a willing heart. And so through all of my life, I look back and I was going, I don't know if I can be considered a good man because I've made so many mistakes. I've had so many roadblocks. And for me, it was really liberating to realize it wasn't about the things I had done. It was about my heart position towards God. It was about, will I continue getting up? Will I continue humbling myself? Will I continue confessing and saying I have messed up? And so I've had a million different roadblocks. I wish I could say, as a pastor's kid and the son of people who write books on family and Christianity, that I just had a perfect path, and I wish I did. But there were many years in my life where I have been a prodigal. There are many years when I have struggled with unhealthy aspects of sexuality. I have struggled with mental illness. I have struggled with anger. I've struggled with deep doubt. I have struggled with so many different things in my life. But ultimately, when I look and say, I don't know if I can be a good man because I've struggled with these things, my hope lies in, as long as I humble myself and ultimately commit myself to God and continue going back to him, continue letting my heart be turned towards him, like David, like Peter, like Paul. That is my hope, that even through my mistakes, if I continue getting up and following my creator, that will be the hope that I can become the man God created me to be.
Yeah, that's great. And I think that's what I really appreciate so much about you and about your book is sometimes it takes somebody in the room willing to step out and say, I don't have it all together. I've been pursuing God, but not perfectly. And you really lay yourself out in the book and are honest about your struggles in that discovery. As you learn to kind of walk more closely with God. So I appreciate that.
Thank you. I'm so glad. It's always scary being the person, or being someone who speaks up and says, yeah, I don't have it all together, because I have this desire to look like I do. I think a lot of guys do it. Maybe it's pride, maybe it's ego, but I want to look like, oh, I'm the good Christian guy. I've never struggled, I've never fallen, I've never been tempted, and if I have, I've met it with perfect resolve. But the reality is, I'm a man, I'm a human, and I have fallen and messed up, but thank goodness my hope is not in me.
Yeah.
And that's where, thanks again for sharing how much you do, because it's a little refreshing. I think a lot of the guys I'm around, like I help lead a small group of high school guys, and talking to them, it's really easy to, like you said, want to put off this presentation of having it all together and being the Christian guy, especially if you're in any sort of a leadership setting. But at the same time, living in that can be really hard too, because you yourself know there's a disconnect there, that even though I might be presenting myself in this way, yourself that I'm actually like a sinner and I'm maybe struggling. And so it's hopefully freeing to the people that are listening to this a little bit, that it is okay to not have it all figured out. And that's just part of that journey and being a good man. And we're all going to stumble, but that doesn't inhibit God's ability to work through us.
I'm just heartily agreeing with what you said. Absolutely.
Okay. I did want to take a minute too to just, I guess, talk about a point that's kind of near and dear to my heart. In your book, you talk about how powerful stories are and how they have this unique ability to change, teach, and inspire us. And that's part of, like my dad mentioned at the beginning, how I'm working on this nonprofit that's very centered around, I guess, storytelling. As I've spent time in the Word, the Lord really showed me that we're supposed to be sharing our testimonies or stories of what He did. And God usually uses those acts of kindness or what He does in our lives as so like my nonprofit's Banner Media, it's this idea of raising a banner of God did this act for me or whoever's story we're telling, but it's also supposed to be a banner to you to see that God loves you or wants to do something similar in your life. And so
I love that.
Just that whole storytelling piece, I thought was really cool that you included that. And I don't know if you just want to take a minute to kind of unpack how does story, I guess, impact us in our pursuit of being a good man, or like what role does it play?
Yeah, stories are very near and dear to my heart, but I kind of believe that they're near and dear to everyone's heart. I think there's something that God designed humanity with to respond to stories. And as I look at scripture, as I look at Jesus's ministry, what I see is constantly this concept of story. God shared His entire truth through this story of this small nation. And then Jesus comes and He shares most of His wisdom very often, and his theology through parables, through story. And so I think that God knows, as our Creator, that He intentionally designed us to respond to stories. So I think grabbing hold of this perspective that we are a story and that our choices in our lives are telling a story is so, so important. As a kid, I grew up in the things that were the most meaningful to me and most effective to me as a kid who wanted to grow up were stories. I can remember the first time I talked about this in the book, that I saw Lord of the Rings, and after I finished watching, for months and years after that, I had this image of Aragorn in my head and wanting to be the hero of a story. And I would, build forts and fight imaginary enemies. And recently I just got my my best friend a life-size version of one of the swords from one of the main characters that he'd always wanted as a birthday gift. But and we're men, but these stories still have this place in our heart because they give us this perspective for how life ought to be lived, for the kind of people we can be. And so when I have a mindset of my life as a story, I start seeing myself as a character in that story, and suddenly my choices matter, and suddenly my decisions actually have weight. And suddenly I have hope, because I have hope to tell a great story, especially when I do that in conjunction with the storyteller, the Creator Himself, God. And so I don't know. Sometimes it's ineffable. It's hard to describe, but I just think stories are so utterly important to humans and men in grabbing a hold of this perspective that we are in a story. And when we realize that, it'll give us hope and direction, and start bringing weight to our lives. I as a young kid, as I said, I love stories so much. I always wanted to be a part of them. which ultimately made me grow up to be a writer, a filmmaker, and an actor, because I saw the power of stories. And so I want to, through this book, encourage men to start seeing their lives as stories, because I think that'll ultimately have such a huge effect on the lives we live.
Yeah. Do you think that's a good place to start? I mean, you unpack in the book too, just kind of in some respects how our our men are in a crisis with our culture. It's sending so many different messages and mixed messages of what it means to be a good man. Do you think asking that question of, what kind of story do I want my life to tell or want to be about, and going back to kind of that idea that we were lived to connect with our Creator, do you think that's a good place to start with those two pieces when you're asking that question?
Yeah, I absolutely do. I think that's, as you look at Jesus, when he would interact with people the first time, it would often be in the context, in a way, even metaphorically speaking, of showing them that they had a story to tell and they had a choice to make, and the choice suddenly mattered. I think men today are very lost because we live in a kind of a post-God era, I think, and when you take God out of it, you take purpose and you take meaning out of life, and ultimately you take story out of life. And so men are living life now believing that their lives don't matter, that they aren't a story, that nothing they do ultimately will make a difference. And I think a lot of men today are living in a culture that just wants to distract them, and wants to kind of sedate them in these meaningless pursuits and addiction, whatever it might be. But I think when God enters, he says, you have a story. And I think that's like you said, one of the first things and the entry points to becoming a good man is learning to hold this perspective, to grasp this perspective of, oh, I am a character and my choices matter, and the things I do will affect the story I'm telling. I am in a story, and it can be a great one should I let my Creator lead me through it. And so I definitely think that's a wonderful place to start. I think it's probably the place to start.
Yeah, yeah. And our culture defines manhood by so many different things, but character doesn't always seem to kind of rise to the top of that list. Why don't you think we value character more? Because as you unpack what being a good man is, a lot of them have to do with characteristics that have to do with character. So why do you think we don't value character more?
I think it kind of goes back to what we've been talking about, that if you look at all of modern culture and you take out any eternal consequences, any eternal echoings of our choices that make an eternal difference, then ultimately nothing means anything, nothing matters. And I think that's a really heavy thing to have to live with. I don't know how I would if I didn't have this belief in God and belief in the Creator. But I think if I had to hazard a guess what it would look like if I suddenly didn't believe in God, I think it would be, well, my choices don't really matter, so I might as well do whatever can make me feel the best before it all ends. And I think that character goes out the window in this scenario. I think there's no use for it ultimately if we're all going to die and nothing really means anything. But as soon as God enters the picture, everything means something. Everything means everything. And suddenly how we live matters, and how we get from believing that nothing really matters to actually living a life that is after God is through the practices of character. You're not going to be good in one day. Of course, we're going to make mistakes. That's so natural. But the more we practice, work out that muscle of character, the more we're going to see in our lives the benefits of it, and ultimately a better story because of it. So I think the more we practice, the fruits of the Spirit, if you just want to boil it down to what they are, the love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, self-control, and on, those things, as we practice those, will shape not only us, but the stories we're telling and the worlds around us. And that's one thing I have noticed in looking around and studying culture of men and how we affect the world today. I studied all these subcultures and kind of the behavior of men, what they look like today. And so often the decisions that men are making are selfish and self-centered, and ultimately really leave a destructive mark on the world. And you see this in every area of society. You even see it in church, whether it's greed, whether it's selfishness, whether it's pride, whether it's ego. You see that these things come as a lack of character. And so I think the only way to combat this destructive reality in our culture, the things that men have created, is through the practice of character, these attributes that we must take on if we want to live a great story. After we've already accepted that, once we have accepted that we are in a story, we have to take on the practicing, the working out of character, because that will shape who we are in the stories we tell.
That's good.
I like how you related character to being necessary to have that great story too, because I've wondered if part of why character seems to be slipping, if you want to say that, in society today is just in part because it's so much harder. And so, like you said, like if it doesn't matter, why would you choose the harder path if the easier one, where you aren't trying to grow in character, is not any worse or better technically? And I've been having that conversation with, like I said, these high schoolers that I lead a small group for. Of our goal is 1 month of the year, or throughout the year. So we have these 12 different character traits of Jesus that we're kind of focusing on, one per month, trying to grow in. And we've been having this conversation of like, look, I get it can be so much harder to be humble or giving, or like right now we're in peace, which is like Jesus was so peaceful, and how hard is that with all the crazy going on in our world today? And so it's this conversation of like, it is hard, but I've also noticed through these conversations we've had that if you press into the difficulty of it, you also actually usually get what you really want. And that's what I've found so interesting, is that so many men, they might take this easier path, but at the same time, I feel like they realize something is lacking, and there seems to just be a disconnect in there somewhere that character might really be the solution. And so I like how you, I guess, put those together. It's a good way of thinking about it.
It's interesting. I've been talking with a friend lately. There's this passage, again, C.S. Lewis, as you can tell, I'm a fan, but he talks about how it's not that we desire too much, it's that we don't desire enough. And what I see in a lot of men today, both believer, non-believer, secular, whatever it might be, we have these intrinsic desires that God has given us, desire to be who we created to be, desire to be a hero, to be good, to bring health and goodness, to bring strength to our world, to have value, to bring others value. But I think that we haven't learned to desire enough. And so we allow our desires to be satisfied in ways so far below what they could be. Because I think a lot of times the church expected kids to be moral out of in a vacuum. But really, if you want kids and anyone to act in a way that's good and moral and upright, that's not just in a moralistic way, that's a list of rules. You have to give them a vision for why their decisions matter. You have to give them an ultimate picture for why being a man of character, making hard choices ultimately matters. And for us, we know that the deepest desires of our heart are to be in connection with God, and that's where real fulfillment is. And so we don't have to fill those desires with cheap ego or pride or conquest. So ultimately, I think if you want to convey to men why their decisions matter, if you want them to know why character, making those hard decisions, actually matters, if you want to see men make the hard decision, like you said, you have to give them a vision for why they're making these choices in the first place. Because ultimately, if nothing matters, they're not going to make these choices, and it won't matter. But we have to teach ourselves and the people around us to desire so much more, so that they see why being a man of character, making those hard choices actually matters. And you have to give them that vision for why it does.
So speaking of, I guess, character, another point I wanted to bring up was you talked a bit about God's design for relationships. And I do think that as we're talking about being a good man, one of the people that actually impacts most is typically, or at least first maybe, is our wife, our spouse. And so I guess just to start, you say how society has moved away from God's design for relationships. So if you just want to unpack that a little bit, and then what does it look like to get back to God's design? We can maybe start there.
Yeah, this is a really interesting one to me. And you're right. I really think that as we become good men, or if we're becoming worse men, some of the people who are first affected are going to be women in our lives, especially the ones we're in relation with in one way or another. And it was a really interesting experience to live in LA during the Me Too movement. And, which was obviously this movement that had all these stories coming out of Hollywood and other industries where men had been abusive or predatory on women in sexual ways. And it's ultimately, as we would say it, really misusing how sexuality and connection and romance ought to be used. But it also wasn't surprising to me. I was actually surprised at how surprised everybody was,
Sure.
because we have this culture that is moving totally away from God, kicking him out of everything. A culture that says it doesn't matter, do what you want, do it if it feels good. And then all of a sudden we're surprised that this thing that we've cheapened and this thing that we've had a low view on for years is being used in a cheap and abusive manner. Like, I don't understand why people are so surprised. And of course it makes me sad, and this is terrible. And I want this kind of behavior to stop in any industry towards anyone. And my heart goes out to anyone who has ever experienced this. I knew people who experienced this, and I saw it firsthand. But I think ultimately, if we want to see those kind of things decrease in the world, we do have to come back to a view of sexuality, romance, relationship in God. Again, God designed, he's a designer, he's a creator, and everything he designed has purpose, both men and everything else. That means he designed sexuality, relationship, and romance with purpose. And until we assent to that design, we're only going to find it being misused and ultimately destructive. And I think that's what we see over and over again in our world, that the culture can't make up its mind if it's this really important thing that can be wielded in really hurtful ways, or if it doesn't mean anything and we should just do whatever we want with it. But I think really, until we come back to this high view of sexuality, relationships, and romance, that we're going to continue seeing it wield an ugly head that's ultimately very destructive towards both us and the people and the women and the people in this world. And so it's a hard path, and it's one that is really difficult to find the nuances of, because I think, one of the church's initial responses was shame. It was, well, if you've done anything bad or if you've messed up any way, you're permanently scarred and you're no good. But that's not the message of Christ. The message of Christ is redemption and goodness and new life. But also the message of Christ isn't just permissiveness and cheap sex. It's the message of Christ is, I think, to have a high view of sex that comes from God, that comes from our Creator, is one where it sees these things as good and beautiful, but also holy, things to be respected, things to be within the confines of commitment, the way he designed it. So I think ultimately, if you want to see the destruction that we've seen through relationships and sexuality and romance in the past few years and ultimately the past few decades, we have to return to this high view of relationships that only can be found out through connection to a Creator who has showed us and tells us how to live this out in the design he created it in.
Yeah, God definitely puts a weight on marriage that we don't today. I mean, you look in the Bible and where God describes marriage, he talks about how husbands are supposed to love their wives like Christ loved the church, and that's kind of his thing for us. And like Christ died for his church, like there's some weight to that, and that's been challenging for me even as I think about my marriage. Like, do I hold it to that level where I would, like, my life, whatever it costs, I put myself down, I lay myself down for my marriage, for my wife, and having that mentality in everything I do, it totally flips your decision making on its head. But then it's kind of cool too, because I think in that it humbles you to a point where, as I've pursued becoming a good man or a better man, now my wife is on my side, and she's I'm humbled to the point of letting her give me some input in that and help me along.
Absolutely.
And so I've kind of noticed that she's probably one of the biggest reasons that I've grown is just I've seen her pray for me, support me, help me grow. And so I don't know if you've experienced that too, but have women in your life, I guess, helped you in your pursuit of being a good man as well as you've stepped into that?
Yeah, absolutely. And man, there's so many rabbit trails to go down because it's such a big and important question. But I got married last year, almost a year, November 11th, and almost a year anniversary coming up right now. And I had written the book Good Man before I got married. And, I of course know I have mistakes, but I was like, I think I got this down. I think I'm, getting this down. I think I'm becoming a real good guy. And then I get married, and all of a sudden, I don't know if it's like this for you or for anyone else listening, but all of a sudden you start realizing how many weaknesses you have, and how you struggle. And when you bring this person into your life and you have a whole nother responsibility, I realized how selfish I was and still am. And I think it's this really interesting thing that that marriage humbled me and is humbling me, and it forces me to realize that I need God, and that to love someone else, it's easier to love yourself, I think. But when you have someone else you are interacting with, it brings a whole new aspect of having to rely on God and realize and come face to face with your own shortcomings and proclivities and selfishness and mistakes and ego and pride. So God has, in enormous ways, used my wife to pull me closer to Him in that way. And also, I would like to encourage any men out there who are not married. I can't tell you how important it is to look for someone. We talked about this with community earlier, but to look for someone who are they themselves chasing God. Because when you are with a partner, with a wife who is every morning, they are communicating with the Creator, they are becoming the woman they're meant to be, then all of a sudden you will find yourself encouraged, supported in this walk that you're both taking together. And, I have been in relationships where that wasn't the reality. And, because of emotion or just attraction, or ultimately leads to destruction if you both don't have your eyes on God. But being with a woman now who is looking at God, who can encourage me, who is learning herself, who can, like you said, speak into my life and give me wisdom, I can't tell you how valuable that has been into me growing. Last year, I had written the book, and then I got married and realized there was a lot more to becoming a good man I couldn't even imagine. And God used my wife as a way to really begin that process again of, I have a lot of work to do. And it's a loving, gentle, graceful, forgiving process. But in the right relationship, God can use a partner to bring you so much closer to Him than you could have on your own.
Well, that's good. I know working in publishing, we'll have to come up with a good man, marriage edition or something.
Oh, yeah. Good woman.
I can tell you, almost 29 years of marriage here, and it's still, you still find those parts of you that need to be shaped off. But like we were saying earlier, it's humbling, and it's maybe the harder road in some respects. I mean, marriage is staying committed to each other and staying married 25 or 29 years in. It's, you've got seasons of hard, but it is beautiful at the same time.
Yeah, I think this culture doesn't have an appreciation for commitment anymore. And I think you talk to anyone who works out regularly, who has ever gone on a health journey or whatever it is, commitment and everyday commitment is ultimately what brings about the best things in life. And I think it's so sad to me, the relationships that I watch today, and how common divorce and abandonment and infidelity is, and really just a lack of commitment, and how much is lost because we haven't learned the art of committing to something that's hard. Because ultimately when we commit to something that's good, even though it's hard, we see the beauty at the end of it. And even after just of a year, I'm already seeing the goodness and beauty come as a result of committing my life to this woman.
That's awesome. Yeah. And so speaking of, I had mentioned I'm coming up here on 29 years. I'm a dad of 5 kids. And my youngest is right on the edge of adolescence. So, he's at this point where he's going to start trying to figure out his identity as a man more and more. And so for parents listening today, Nathan, I'm wondering if you can give us some suggestions on how we can instill some of these good man qualities into our boys.
Yeah, I think as I look back, I was really, really lucky to have the family I did. And I'm sure that a lot of listeners know my family and know my mom and my dad. And I was really in know kind of their philosophy and their hearts. But I was lucky to experience that firsthand. And I think what I saw is an experience with my own life is I wasn't given just a list of rules. I wasn't given just a moral to-do list that you just should do these things and that's it. Instead, I was given a few things. I was given one, a vision for my life as a story. And we talked about that earlier. And a vision that my life mattered and the choices that I had actually had an ultimate effect and mattered, really that really affected me as a young kid. And when I would be exposed to these great stories, be it Lord of the Rings or Narnia, whatever it is, I started, because I had these voices in my head, because of my parents saying you can live a great story, that helped me envision myself as someone who wanted to do good, who wanted to have character, who wanted to practice the things so I could be the hero of my own story. So one who's given a vision to your young kids, to your adolescents, that they matter, that their choices matter, that they can be a hero in their story. And two, I would say I was given an introduction to God in a very personal and real way. Again, I think so many people think that an introduction to God is a list of morals or traditions, or sometimes even just a political party, when in reality, an interaction and a connection to God and an introduction is an introduction with the living creator who you can communicate with and know, and he knows you. And so ultimately, I think the thing that ultimately made the most difference in my life was having a connection, being introduced to a connection to a real and living God who I knew, and in every asset of my life growing up, he was real, he was there. And so giving an introduction beyond just a moral list to a real, loving, laughing, giving, graceful God affected me. And then I think lastly, I think there's a lot of, in life, there's a lot of pressure to look like something or to be something. And something else I was given that came along with these things was grace, and the understanding that I was made uniquely, and that God's story is unique for me, and that I didn't have to look like my brother. I didn't have to look like anybody else, that God had made me uniquely, and that I wasn't forced into a mold. I wasn't forced to look like something or pretend to be something, that I was allowed to be human, and that grace came along and filled in those cracks. But because of the relationship I was given, because of that vision I was given, it's not a moral list that we give our kids. It's a vision, it's a relationship, and it's grace. And I think that ultimately is what has led me through even the hardest parts of my life to continue fighting to become the man I was made to be.
I really like that vision piece. Actually, I've been getting to the point where more and more people are starting to ask my wife Cassie and I if we're going to have kids soon, and I'm sure my parents would appreciate a grandchild and all that.
We're waiting.
It's been coming up, and I've been thinking about what it means to be a father and what that looks like. And looking at David, it's really interesting how much he prays for his son Solomon. And God told David, you're not going to build the temple, but your son is. And so as Solomon was growing up, you see how David was, speaking into his life and praying over him that he would live into that vision that the Lord had given him of who he wanted his son to be, or who God wanted his son to be. And that's been something, I think it fits with, like I said, what God's been showing me is already my wife and I were kind of praying for the kids that we will have, whenever that is, that Lord, you have who you've made our future kids to be, and we want to pray that they would grow into that. And I think that alone can just be a really, just impactful thing to do over their lives. And so it's cool just to hear you highlight that point.
Absolutely. I love that.
Yeah, that's great. Well, we appreciate you taking the time to be with us today, Nathan. And I know there are plenty of guys listening today who either are struggling with their own sense of manhood or feel a heavy burden to raise sons who are good men. Would you mind, as we kind of wrap things up, just saying a prayer that these men would take hold of God's design in their lives?
Absolutely. God, thank you so much for every man listening, and every man that's going to listen. Thank you that you have designed us with intention and purpose, and just the idea of that we can know that we have value, and that there's a reason that we are here, and there's a person that we were created to be. And thank you so much for giving us an example of who that is. Thank you for that we have Jesus to look to. Thank you that you have communicated with us, that you are a God of relation, and that you interact with us on this journey. And thank you that you are a God of grace, that you know we are human and that we fail. And thank you for your forgiveness, that when we do, that you can lift us up again and we can get back on this path. God, I want to pray that every man listening will begin to see that his life is a story being authored by the Creator, And if we let him write our story, it will be a good one. I pray that every man would see the importance of his choices that he's making. I pray that every man would have the wherewithal to lean into character and the practice and the working out of those muscles so that we can tell better stories with our lives, so that we can bring life and love to the worlds and people around us. And I pray that every man would again catch this vision for who you created us to be. We love you. We thank you for your presence and love, grace, and forgiveness in our lives. In your name, amen.
Amen. So the book is Good Man. I'd strongly encourage you to pick it up for husband or for yourself, or if you do, like Josh, have a small group. It's a great book to go through. I know I'm going to have it on my shelf to go through with Josh's younger brother here coming up. And so great book. Strongly recommend it. Nathan, how can people connect with you if they want to get in touch or learn more about the book or what you're doing?
Yeah, you can, a few different ways. You can find me on all the social media. Just search my name, Nathan Clarkson. You can go to my website, nathanclarkson.me. Send me a message. I love hearing from people. I love connecting with like-minded people. It always means a lot. And you can also catch me on my podcast called The Overthinkers, where we talk about faith and philosophy and art and all the big questions and fun stuff. And that's pretty much everywhere that podcasts are. So I love hearing from people, and that's how you can get a hold of me.
Great. Thanks so much. And thanks again for joining us today on the Growing Home Together podcast. We'd love to connect with you even more over on our website at growinghometogether.com. And we're caring for the soul of your family and growing home together with you.